This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
ఇది ఫ్యాన్ కొద్దిగా తగ్గించండి లేకపోతే. If you can hear me, one of you say yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I want to know, one girl has asked me last class. I don't know who that girl name is. I don't know. She asked me about this. Is she there?
Yes, sir.
You only asked this question. Why T3
Yes,
has
sir.
decreased in usually in hypermetabolism T3 should be increased. Okay, why T3 has decreased?
Yes, sir.
You only asked me that question, right?
Yes, sir.
So that reason now I will show you. So actually it is not given in any books. So I found out in the internet and I found an article which is published in September 2020, this year only, in the month of September. There they have given the reason for this. Okay, I'll show you that one. This is the reason for this. So you can see this. This is called as euthyroid 6 syndrome. Okay, this is called as euthyroid 6 syndrome. So what does this euthyroid 6 syndrome is? Patient will be in the euthyroid state. Patient will be in the euthyroid state, but there will be abnormal thyroid function test. There will be abnormal. Patient will not have any thyroid illness, either hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism or any multinodular goiter or any pathological disease of the thyroid gland, and the patient will be perfectly in the euthyroid, but patient will be having some abnormal thyroid function test. Okay, this is called euthyroid 6 syndrome. See, you can see in the first paragraph. So patients with various acute or chronic non-thyroid disorders may have abnormal thyroid function test. Example, here they have given a list of conditions where there will be euthyroid sickness syndrome. See, one is acute and chronic illness, particularly fasting, starvation. In the metabolic response during starvation, I have discussed about this. There will be a decrease. There will be conversion of T4 to T3. Okay, there will be inhibition of T4 to T3 will be inhibited. That process will be there. And in sepsis also, I have told you, sepsis, trauma, sepsis, or any surgery, there will be a decreased T3 production but there will be hypermetabolism. Okay, and in other conditions such as anorexia, thermal injury, anorexia nervosa, cirrhosis, chronic kidney disease, myocardial infarction, and severe trauma. Here in this scenario, what happens is, here you can see there will be a decreased triiodine thyronine levels. Decreased T3 will be there, which is the most common. And next is the patient with more severe or prolonged illness also will have a decreased T4 levels. But there will be an increase in reverse T3. Reverse T3 is nothing but a component of a T4. The peripheral conversion of T4 will happen to T3 and reverse T3, but the reverse T3 content is very less. The reverse T3, the percentage is only 0.9%. Okay, that reverse T3 will increase, but the T3 T4 levels will be decreased. Why this will happen is, see, pathogenesis is unknown. For this, pathogenesis is unknown. They didn't found any particular reason or cause for this. Why during the metabolic response, during the trauma or sepsis, or during the surgery, there will be a state of hypermetabolism, but there will be a decrease in the T3 levels and the T4 levels. The reason for that is they also didn't found anything, but they have given a condition as euthyroid sickness syndrome. Here they have given some reasons, such as it may be due to an effect of pro-inflammatory cytokines and decreased binding of thyroid hormones to thyroid binding globulin. So these are some reasons. Okay, so in a critically ill patient, or who has undergone surgery, or who has met with a trauma, who has admitted into the ICU, for that patients who are not having any thyroid disease, pathological thyroid disease, or who are not having hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism features, for them there is no requirement for thyroid function tests. Okay, that is the last line they have given. Thyroid function test should not be ordered for severely ill patients unless thyroid dysfunction is highly suspected. So for that, the reason is this one only. Okay, have you
Yes, sir.
understood? That is your answer to your question. Okay,
Ma'am,
this is an
today
article
in
which is
medicine also
uh,
they said this in medicine also today euthyroid syndrome was told, sir. Uh,
okay, okay.
type
Then you might.
type 3 deiodinase some enzyme is there which is means not functional to convert the T4 into T3 in that way. It is
So,
in that way.
so this is okay, okay. So this is the main. The pathogenesis is not known, but why it is converting to T4, the T4 T3 levels, why they are getting decreased? The pathogenesis is unknown. This is called euthyroid sickness syndrome, and this is actually this article I have taken from September 2020. Okay, the latest one. Okay,
Okay. Thank you, sir.
okay. So now we will be completing this chapter. Okay, the nutrition. So we have discussed about previously all the nutrition. Okay, how much amount of nutrition, energy requirements, protein requirements, daily feeding regimens. We have discussed everything. Okay, and the nutritional assessment. So once the patient has been nutritionally assessed, whether this patient has to be given or not. Excuse me. Okay. So once the patient is being nutritionally assessed, now we need to see, okay, which patients require the nutritional support. Okay, these are the criteria. These are the criteria which is given in Bailey and Love. This is the criteria you should remember. Definitely, you should remember this. So, if any patient, for example, any patient who come to you, who come to the emergency ward, or who come to the surgical OPD or medicine ward, who gives a history of inadequate intake or no oral intake of food since for the past 5 days or 5 to 7 days, then he should be included in this nutritional support criteria. See the last but one point, anticipate that patient will be unable to meet caloric requirements within so not this one. This is perioperatively. The first point is, if the patient, this is not, that point is not included in this chart. The first point is, if the patient gives a history of not taken any food for the past 5 days, any solid food, solid meal or liquid meal patient has not taken, or he has taken inadequately, then he is eligible to give a nutritional support. Next, past medical history. If the patient gives a past history of severe undernutrition or chronic disease, for example, Crohn's disease or inflammatory bowel disease, or patient if he is suffering from chronic pancreatitis, in such cases there will be definitely some nutritional disorders will be there. Patient will not take a adequate amount of nutrients. So in such cases, chronic diseases, the patient requires a nutritional support. And the second point is, when there is an involuntary loss of more than 10 to 15% of usual body weight, that is involuntary loss. Okay, not by voluntary, not by daily doing exercises, and there will be a decrease in body weight. Not in those persons. When there is an involuntary loss, it could be due to some cancer. That is called, the term is called cancer cachexia, where there will be a loss of weight. Okay, that is due to these cancer causing factors like interleukin 6, interleukin 1, tumor necrosis factor alpha. These are the causes for the poor appetite and decrease in the body weight in cancer patients. So when there is an involuntary loss of more than 10 to 15% of usual body weight within 6 months, or more than 5% of body loss within 1 month, those should be categorized for nutritional support. Next, when you expect a blood loss, of more than 500 ml during surgery, for example, in a blood injury abdomen, okay, splenic trauma or a liver trauma, and some bowel injury. In such cases, you may expect there will be around 500 to 1000 ml of blood loss during surgery. In such cases also, they are included in this nutritional support regimen. Okay, or the weight is less than 20% of the ideal body weight. If the ideal body weight in relation to height and weight, in relation to the age of the patient, height and weight, if he is less than 20% of the ideal body weight, or the body mass index is less than 18.5 kilogram per square meter, those are also these are the patients where we initiate a nutritional support. Next, failure to thrive on pediatric growth and development curves. So these are see, this is less than 5 percentile, less than 5th percentile, or a trend line crossing two major percentile lines. These you can see there are some standard CDC lines, CDC charts and WHO charts, which will give you this information. Okay, CDC, that is Center for Disease and Control charts, CDC charts and WHO charts, especially in pediatric population. If you compare with the weight and kg in relation to the age, if there is less than 5th percentile or a trend line crossing two major percentile lines, those come under failure to thrive candidates. In such patients also, you will be initiating nutritional support. And if you do a biochemical investigation, serum albumin, if it is less than 3.0 gram per deciliter, or a serum transferrin less than 200 milligram percentage, in such cases also you will be initiating a nutritional support. Okay. Next, another thing is anticipate that the patient will be unable to meet caloric requirements within 7 to 10 days perioperatively. That is, so what group of patients is, when you do a perforation, when a patient comes to the emergency department with a septic shock or a hollow viscous perforation, patient is in septic shock, patient is poorly nourished, patient is having gross anemia is there, and once you have shifted the patient to the surgery and you have opened, and there is a lot of pus is there, and the bowel is very pale, and patient is very anemic. Okay, patient is very anemic, and the albumin levels will be obviously low in this case. So in these patients, post-operatively you can't give immediately orally food by oral intake. So in such cases, you have to anticipate that these patients may go into some malnutrition. So in such cases, you need to give some total parenteral nutrition or enteral nutrition in this group of patients. Okay. So next, another thing is catabolic disease. Example, significant burns, trauma, sepsis, and pancreatitis. In these patients, there will be a undernutrition will be there. So these are the criteria where you will initiate a nutritional support. Okay. So there are actually various types of nutrition therapies you will be giving to the patient. One is the enteral nutrition, and another, number 2, is the total parenteral nutrition. So enteral nutrition and total parenteral nutrition, the difference is whatever nutrients you are giving, when you are giving it directly into the gastrointestinal tract, then it is called enteral nutrition. Whereas total parenteral nutrition is parenteral. Parenteral means other than the gastrointestinal tract. Other than the gastrointestinal tract is IV route. So intravenous route. When you give the nutrients, when you provide the nutrients through the IV, through the intravenous tract, then it is called as total parenteral nutrition. Okay. So now coming to the enteral nutrition. So it is defined as the delivery of the nutrients into the gastrointestinal tract. So this can be given by some 3 types of methods. One is whole food by mouth. Whole food by mouth. See, you can see the diagram. You can give, if the patient is able to take orally, then you can give by mouth. Okay, whole food by mouth. Number 2 is you can give sip feeding. You can give sip feeding. Sip feeding means if the patient appetite will be low, but patient is able to take liquids only. Patient cannot able to take solid because patients sometimes they will be intolerant to the solid food due to poor appetite, but they can take liquids, they can tolerate liquids. In such cases you will give sip feedings. Okay, and third type is the tube feedings. The tube may be a nasogastric tube, nasoduodenal tube, or a nasojejunal tube. So this is the nasogastric, where the tip of the tube will be in the stomach. Nasoduodenal is the tip of the tube will be in the duodenum, and nasojejunal is the tip of the tube will be in the jejunum. Okay, this nasogastric, nasoduodenal, or nasojejunal tube, this is actually a blind procedure. You can put it as a blind procedure, or under the guidance of fluoroscopy. Under the guidance of fluoroscopy also, you can insert correctly the tip of the catheter into the duodenum or jejunum. Okay, this your Ryle's tube, that is called Ryle's tube. So Ryle's tube is nasogastric tube. Ryle's tube is actually a blind procedure which we will be commonly performing in a casualty, okay, who come with acute intestinal obstruction or perforation. Okay, so these are the three techniques: whole food by mouth, sip feeding, tube feeding techniques. Okay, next other thing is the gastrostomy tube and the jejunostomy tube. This gastrostomy and jejunostomy tube is a surgical, it is a surgical procedure. Okay, that I will be dealing it with you later. This is actually a surgical procedure where the tube is brought into the stomach from giving a stab incision in the anterior abdominal wall. You give a stab incision here and you will put the tube inside the stomach and you will fix it, the tube, to the overlying anterior abdominal wall skin. Similarly, the jejunostomy tube. Okay, so TPN is total parenteral nutrition and PPN is partial parenteral nutrition. Okay, so when you plan to give the enteral nutrition, so how much requirement, how much amount of energy is required is per ml, it should be able to give 1 to 2 kilocalories per ml. Okay, 1 to 2 kilocalories per ml of energy, and 0.6 gram per ml of protein should be given. Okay, these can be given as polymeric feeds or monomeric. Polymeric means there will be intact carbohydrate or intact protein will be there, whereas monomeric feeds are, you are giving it in a actually you are giving in a amino acid forms, amino acid like glutamine, arginine, alanine, arginine. You are giving in breakdown products of proteins and breakdown products of carbohydrate. Okay, so those are monomeric. Next, sip feeding. Sip feeding is, I have told you, it is given in patients who can drink but with poor appetites. So a 200 ml of carton will be there, which can give 200 kilocalories and 2 grams of nitrogen in the form of protein, 2 grams of nitrogen, and it will provide an energy of 200 kilocalories. So next, third method is the tube feeding techniques. The tube feeding techniques, which includes nasogastric, nasoduodenal, nasojejunal, gastrostomy, and jejunostomy. Okay, this you should remember. So what you give is tube feedings. How you are there when you put a nasogastric tube or a nasoduodenal or a nasojejunal tube. So after putting that, you have to give the fluid. Okay, by taking a 50 ml syringe or a 100 ml syringe, you will connect to the outer part of the tube and you will elevate it above the head end level and you will pour. Initially you will give first water, glucose water, then coconut water, then milk. Gradually you will increase the diet. So initially per hour you have to give 20 to 30 ml, and this is gradually increased every second hourly or fourth hourly. You will gradually increase the dose. Okay, but initially you should give 20 to 30 ml. But at night time, you have to stop this feeding for around 4 to 5 hours. Why? Because this will allow the pH of the normal pH of the this will allow the pH of the stomach to return to its normal level. Okay, that is one reason. And another reason is When you give night time, when you give feeding, there will be a chance of aspiration of the contents into the mouth. There will be a chance of aspiration of the contents into the mouth, which will go into the respiratory tract, and it causes aspiration pneumonia. Okay, so that's why you will not give in the night time, you will not give any feeding to the patient, because the patient is already sick patient. Patient is a very critically ill patient, so patient may aspirate this into the respiratory system. Okay, next another thing is, every in a day, if you take a 2-hour aspirate, now you have put the tube inside the you have put the tube into the stomach. For suppose nasogastric tube has been kept, you have given a 100 ml, you are giving 100 to 200 ml, you have given the food through the liquid diet through the Ryle's tube, and you will wait till evening. Okay, you will wait till evening. So 20 to 30 ml per hour you will be giving like that till evening. So at the night time, for 2 hours you will connect the tube to a bag. Okay, if you connect the tube to the bag, then you can see whether the bag has been full or bag is empty. So why? Because see, if the whatever you have given the liquid meal through the Ryle's tube, if it is collecting into the bag by evening, that indicates that the liquid diet is not going into the distal part of the gastrointestinal tract. It is remaining in the stomach. So if it is more than 200 ml of aspirate is there during any 2-hour period in a day, then feeding. That indicates that patient is not having an adequate bowel movement, and whatever you have given is more than the adequate. Whatever diet you have given, liquid diet, it is more than adequate. So then you have to decrease the feed. Okay, when you give overfeeding also, it is dangerous. So that's why you have to decrease the feed. Next, another thing is the complication of this tube feeding is tube blockage. The tube may be blocked by some this liquid, by milk. The milk gets clogged and gets blocked within the tube. Okay, in such cases you can flush the tube with water twice daily, or there are some agents like chymotrypsin. These are enzymatic agents, chymotrypsin. So these will liquefy the contents which has blocked the tube. Okay, so whenever there is a chance, nasogastric tubes are mostly used rather than nasoduodenal or nasojejunal. But if there is when your feeding is planned for more than 1 week, then you can use fine bore feeding tubes, that is less than 3 mm. The internal diameter of the tube is less than 3 mm, which is made up of silicon. Okay, when you plan a feeding regimen for more than 1 week, then you can use a fine bore feeding tubes. Okay, next procedure, next way of giving tube feeding is gastrostomy. This is called as stam gastrostomy. This is called as stam gastrostomy. The procedure is called stam gastrostomy. This is the insertion of tube through the abdominal wall into the stomach. So this is the way. Okay, from the anterior abdominal wall, you will push a guide wire first. You will push a guide wire into the stomach, and then you will directly actually first you will do a endoscope. When you do an endoscope, you will see the lightning of the light, which is bright light of the stomach. Okay, through that light you will send a guide wire into the stomach. After passing guide wire, then you will pass a tube over the guide wire and you will enter into the stomach, and you will fix to the anterior abdominal wall skin. Okay, this is the gastrostomy tube. So that is procedure is called as percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy, which is most commonly performed procedure for a malnourished person. Okay, these are again of two types, stab technique and another is the transoral technique. This can be done by surgery also. At the time of surgery also, when you perform, for example, when you do a patient severely malnourished, severely anemic, patient has a hollow viscous perforation, patient is having sorry, not hollow viscous perforation, for a case of esophageal carcinoma. For a carcinoma esophagus, patient is unable to eat or drink solid food or liquid food, then you can take the patient post for surgery and you can do a surgery and put directly open the abdomen, put a Malikoff's catheter or a Foley's tube into the stomach. Okay, then through that you can give feeding. That is the gastrostomy, stam gastrostomy. Okay, so if the feeding is planned for 4 to 6 weeks, okay, then ideal is the percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy. Percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy is the ideal procedure if the feeding is for 4 to 6 weeks. If the feeding is for less than 1 week or 1 week, 1 to 2 weeks, then you can go for a nasogastric feeding. But if the feeding is planned for a prolonged duration of 4 to 6 weeks, then ideal is the gastrostomy. And that too, in that the ideal is percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy. But there are some complications with this procedure. So the complications are the tube will be fixed to the lying in the skin and the subcutaneous tissue and the fascia. So there may be a chance of necrotization fasciitis around the tube, or intra-abdominal abscesses may form, and there may be a sepsis around the tube also. So if persistently the tube is within the stomach, okay, for more than 6 weeks, it will produce a gastric fistula. Okay, it will form a gastric fistula. So next is jejunostomy. Jejunostomy, the procedure is called Wittjel's jejunostomy procedure. WITZELS, Wittjel's jejunostomy procedure. So this is similar to that of a gastrostomy procedure. Here you will be directly inserting the tube into the jejunum. Okay, so this is the insertion of tube through the abdominal wall into the jejunum. It can be also performed by endoscopic guidance or by surgical guidance. Okay, so what is the advantage of jejunostomy is, so jejunum, the tube is beyond the pylorus. The tube is placed beyond the pylorus in the jejunum. So by putting the tube beyond the pylorus, there will be less chance of aspiration. So there will be better tolerance to the enteral nutrition, because absorption maximum stomach is mainly for the digestion process, but absorption will be taking mostly in the jejunum and the ileum. Okay, so when the tube is placed in the jejunum, there will be better enteral nutrition rather than putting in the stomach. Okay, so the complications of the jejunostomy are similar to that of the gastrostomy, that is necrotizing fasciitis, sepsis around the tube, intra-abdominal abscess, the sometimes jejunal fistula. Okay, sometimes if the tube gets displaced and leaked, there will be a leakage of bile into the peritoneal cavity and will cause peritonitis. Okay, so these are the complications. So what are the contraindications? So now we have discussed what are the indications for enteral nutrition. What are the contraindications for enteral nutrition? That is where you should not put a gastrostomy or jejunostomy tube, or where you should not give tube feeding. So when the patient is having some intractable vomiting, you can't put a tube inside. Patient will vomit that one also. So that's why when intractable vomiting, diarrhea which is not responding to medical management, that is one condition. And another thing is paralytic ileus, where there will be no adequate bowel movements, that is patient is having sepsis, intra-abdominal sepsis. Patient will not bowel movements will not be there. In such cases, in paralytic ileus also there will be very less absorption or no absorption. Okay, next, acute GI obstruction, high output intestinal fistulas. In high output intestinal fistulas, so whenever the stomach, when you do a jejunostomy or an ileostomy, in such patients, when you put when you put the tube inside the stomach or the small bowel, whatever liquid is going into the bowel will be coming out of the jejunum stoma or a ileal stoma. So that is not at all useful. Next is GI obstruction. So okay, it is GI whenever there is a gastrointestinal ileal obstruction or a jejunal obstruction, small bowel obstruction. What happens if you put the tube? There is no use, because whatever will be whatever liquids you are giving through the tube, it will be pulled up in the obstructed segment. Okay. Next is diffuse peritonitis. Diffuse peritonitis, when there is a hollow viscous perforation with peritonitis, you can't give the tube feeding. So whatever you give through that hole in the perforation through the perforated part, everything will be going into the peritoneal cavity. Next is the severe shock and hemodynamic instability and severe gastrointestinal hemorrhage, severe short bowel syndrome. Short bowel syndrome also, there will be very less chance for absorption of the nutrients. So whatever you give through the tube, it will be all useless. Okay, there will be no absorption. Okay. Next, severe gastrointestinal malabsorption. Any malabsorption syndromes also there will be. It is a tube feedings are also tube feedings are contraindicated. Next, inability to gain access to the gastrointestinal tract. Inability means you can't pass. For example, if the patient is having some nasal masses or nasal blockade, you can't insert a tube. Okay, so there are some conditions where you can't insert the tube, where you cannot get access to the gastrointestinal tract. In such conditions, this is contraindicated. Okay, and when there is a need for an enteral nutrition less than 7 days, if only 7 days less than 1 week, also it is contraindicated. Next, what are the complications of enteral nutrition? So complications of enteral nutrition are divided into tube related, gastrointestinal, metabolic complications and infective complications. So tube related is where when you put the tube, it is not in the position. If it is not, if it gets coiled in the esophagus, or if it is coiled, if it is not kept in the proper position. So then also if you give liquid and if you give the nutritional, it will not be useful. Okay, once you have put the tube inside the stomach or the jejunum, if it gets displaced or it may be blocked, then also the nutrition is inadequate. The whatever you are giving is useless. So these are the complications. Sometimes the tube may get leaked or the tube may get broken inside. So these are the various tube related complications. Okay, when you put the tube inside the through the nasal mucosa into the esophagus and stomach, there may be a chance of erosion of the skin and the mucosa. Okay, there will be injury to the mucosa. Next is gastrointestinal complications of enteral nutrition. One is the diarrhea. Why diarrhea occurs is sometimes we'll give for the critical ill patients, we are giving the antibiotics. So these antibiotics will damage the colonic flora, normal colonic microflora. So in such cases, along with this antibiotics, you are giving enteral nutrition. So for colonic microflora, intestinal flora are required for the normal fermentation of the carbohydrates. Okay, if they get destroyed by the antibiotics, there will be associated diarrhea will be there. Next, there may be a bloating, nausea, vomiting will be there. So if you give overfeeding, more than the adequate nutrition, if you give, overload the patient with liquids, okay, then the patient may have a bloat. Okay, patient will have some abdominal tightness, distinction of the upper abdomen. Okay, and patient will have a nauseating feeling and a feel to vomit. Okay, next, abdominal cramps and aspiration and constipation. So these are the some of the gastrointestinal complications of enteral nutrition. And another are the metabolic and biochemical. So there are some electrolyte. There will be, when you give an enteral feeding, that is called as we tell as refeeding syndrome. Refeeding syndrome you can see in TPN also, and enteral nutrition. So when a prolonged malnourished individual, when you start on artificial feeding, there will be shift of fluid and electrolytes within the intestine. Within the small bowel, there will be shift of the fluid and the electrolytes. This is due to some hormonal or metabolic imbalances. Metabolic and hormonal factors will act. This will lead to refeeding syndrome. That is, there will be an electrolyte disorders will be there. Vitamin and mineral trace element deficiency will be there. Next is the drug interactions. And another the complication is the infective complication. So exogenous and endogenous. Exogenous is handling contamination. If you are not wearing a proper glove, if it is not a, if you're not doing the procedure in a aseptic using aseptic precautions, you are not following aseptic precautions, then there may be a chance of infection. Another thing is endogenous. Patient may have endogenously some septic foci. Okay. These are the complications of enteral nutrition. So next, coming to the total parenteral nutrition. Parenteral nutrition is, I have told you, without using the gastrointestinal tract, you are giving directly into the intravenous IV route. Okay. The indication of TPN are nothing but the contraindications of enteral nutrition. What I have told you before, this is the contraindication. So wherever the enteral nutrition, where we have not conditions where we can't give enteral nutrition, tube feeding, there we can give total parenteral nutrition. So this is the total parenteral nutrition bag. You can see 3 bags will be there. This is a mixed solution. There will be carbohydrate, fat, protein will be there. This is a mixed solution. Okay. So this can be given through a central line or peripheral line. So central line is directly into the external jugular or internal jugular vein or the subclavian vein, whereas peripheral line is where you keep at the wrist veins. Okay. So that substrates are, you can give a carb, fat and protein mix, or a glucose fat emulsion, or an isotonic fat emulsion. So the daily requirements is 25 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day. Okay. So this is the protein mix. This is the AminoWell. This is the brand name is the AminoWell, trade name. See, it contains high quality of intravenous amino acid solution. Okay. It contains multiple amino acids will be there. This is the protein infusion, which we will be giving frequently in malnourished patients and post-op patients who are severely anemic or hypoproteinemic. We will give this AminoWell protein infusion, amino acid infusion. Okay. This is the intravenous fat emulsion. Okay. Celipid. Okay. The trade name is Celipid. So it contains medium to long chain fatty acid, triglycerides. Okay. So peripheral line. So central line and peripheral line. So peripheral line is, this is peripheral line is used when there is a short term feeding. When you plan the feeding for only 2 weeks, then you can use a peripheral line. That is, you will insert a catheter, insert a peripherally, PICC is peripherally inserted central vein catheter. That is, through the wrist vein or cubital vein, you will pass a catheter which will be guided into the central vein. Okay. Next, another that is called peripherally inserted central vein catheter, or a short IV cannula. You, for blood transfusion, for IV fluid infusions, you use short IV cannula, 20 gauge or 18 gauge. Through that also you can give total parenteral nutrition. The survival time is of peripherally inserted central venous cannula is 7 days only. Okay, again you have to change it. And the short IV cannula, what you give for for blood transfusion or IV fluid transfusion, you give this you insert the short IV cannula at the wrist. Okay. This is more prone for thrombophlebitis, so it has to be changed every 12 hours. So if you put on the right wrist and give the TPN, again after 12 hours you have to remove it and you have to replace it on the left wrist vein. Okay. So because there will, the most important complication with this type of peripheral TPN is thrombophlebitis. Okay. Next is the next route of administer of TPN is the central line. So the best ideal is the infraclavicular subclavian vein. Infraclavicular subclavian vein, that is ideal. Or you can give through, you can insert the catheter into the directly into the internal jugular vein, or you can insert through the external jugular vein. But internal jugular, external jugular is very bit cumbersome to the patient, because the patient will be moving his neck frequently, so there may be a chance of blockage of the catheter. So the best is infraclavicular subclavian vein. Okay. So this can be done as a blind procedure. Okay, this can be done as a catheter insertion into the central vein. Is mostly it is a blind procedure. So if you are not well versed with the technique, you can do it under an ultrasound guidance or a fluoroscopy. Next is for long-term TPN, Hickman central lines is used. I will show you the diagram of the Hickman central line. You just remember the name, Hickman central line. Okay. So after putting the central line, you have to do a post-procedure chest X-ray. You have to do a chest X-ray. Why? Because so when you insert the cannula and when you put a guide wire, and over the guide wire you will send the catheter. This is the process. So when you insert the guide wire, there may be a chance of injury to the lung. There may be a chance of injury to the lung. So it will result in pneumothorax. So that you should confirm on the chest X-ray after the procedure. So you should see whether there is any pneumothorax or not. If there is no pneumothorax, okay, your procedure you have done it well. Okay. Next, you should look for the position of the catheter tip. The catheter tip should be at the distal part of the superior vena cava. Then only it is the ideal. It should not go into the heart. Okay. It should be exactly at the distal part of the superior vena cava. So there are some multi-lumen central vein catheters are also available. Okay, nowadays multi-lumen central vein catheters are also available, where through that lumen only exclusively nutrition. For example, there will be 3 lumens will be there which are inserted into the central vein. Through one lumen there will be color coding will be there, red, blue, and green will be there. So for suppose green you will give nutrition, blue you will give IV fluids, or red color you will be giving some other antibiotics. So there will be specific exclusively one lumen you will be dedicated for giving nutrition of total parenteral nutrition. So these are multi-lumen central vein catheters which are nowadays they are getting popular. Okay. So I don't know, this is the Hickman's line. So there will be, see, this is the clavicle will be there. So here you will, under the ultrasound guidance or fluoroscopy, you will place the catheter. You will place the catheter, you will guide through the subclavian vein and you will reach the superior vena cava. Okay, the tip should be at the distal part of the superior vena cava. That you will check through the post-procedure chest X-ray. So this catheter has a hub is there. It has 2 wings is there. Then here you will suture the hub to the anterior chest wall skin. Okay, so to prevent the movement of the hub. So this is the procedure. Okay, whereas when you put other mode is the internal jugular vein. What I have told you is you will place a catheter from here through the neck. It will go inside through the internal jugular vein and go into the superior vena cava. So but this patient will be frequently moving his neck on either side, left side, right side. So what happens, there will be a chance of misplacement of the tube. So the ideal thing is infraclavicular subclavian vein insertion of the Hickman's line to give the parenteral nutrition. Okay. So these are the complications of the total parenteral nutrition. This this should be remembered. So it is related to nutrient deficiency. That is, you should not overfeed or you should not underfeed. So this is the related to underfeeding. So when you underfeed the patient may go into hypoglycemia. Patient may have hypocalcemia. Patient may have hypophosphatemia and magnesemia. This is called as refeeding syndrome. So I have told you refeeding syndrome occurs due to some metabolic and hormonal factors which causes a rapid shifts of the fluid and electrolytes, which in a malnourished patient where an artificial feeding has started. So that refeeding syndrome definition is that one. Okay. Next, another thing is there will be a deficiency of essential fatty acid and zinc and minerals. Okay. What is related to overfeeding? When you overfeed the patient may go into hyperglycemia, patient may go into hyperosmolar dehydration. It results in hepatic steatosis, hypercapnia, increased sympathetic activity, fluid retention, and some electrolyte abnormalities. So excess fat, excess amino acid will result in hypercalcemia, aminoacidemia, and hypercholesterolemia. So these are the complications related to overfeeding. So when complications related to sepsis, if the same catheter is not the catheter is inserted without following the proper precautions, then it may lead to outside infection. You are transmitting your sending into the directly into the intravenous route. So it may result in catheter related sepsis. Okay, and this will lead to systemic sepsis. Once it has gone into the central main superior vena cava from the heart, it will directly go to the circulatory system. So it will finally result into systemic sepsis. Okay. Next, related to the line. So I have told you, when the line is not properly inserted, or when you put a guide wire into the main central vein, it may injure a lung tissue, causing pneumothorax, or an adjacent artery may be damaged, causing a severe what is that, hemorrhage, severe hemorrhage, and there may be a chance of air embolism. So the outside air may enter into the central vein, causing air embolism, and near to that will be the thoracic duct. There may be a thoracic duct damage. You may directly overdo the procedure, and you may directly injure the heart. Okay, they result in cardiac perforation, cardiac tamponade, and sometimes pleural effusion. Okay, so long-term use may cause occlusion and thrombosis of the. So wherever the catheter is there within the vein, there will be an associated thrombophlebitis. Later, a thrombus formation will be there and causing occlusion of the tube. Okay, so that is the end of this enteral nutrition. Okay, so next class we will discuss other topics. So when is your exam? Final exam? Can any one of you tell when is your final MBBS exam?
Not yet given, sir.
Usually probably April.
January, sir. January or February.
So I would like to discuss some questions, not like this. Okay, not discussing a whole chapter like that. I'll discuss some important topics. I'll discuss like question and answer type scenario. Okay, question and answer type. What are the most commonest questions which are being asked in the final MBBS examination? That I will be discussing. Okay, this will be actually this topic actually was given by Dr. Lokanatham sir to discuss. So actually it will be actually a vast topic. If I say like this, you will not be able to understand. You will just understand the concept, but how to write in the examination is very important. Okay, you have to understand the concept, you have to understand the subject, then you should be able to write in a proper way. Okay, whenever a question is given, you should be able to skeletonize the answer. Skeletonize the answer is, so whenever a question has been given, for example, any appendicitis has been given, so what is the definition of appendicitis, what is the etiological factors, one heading, and what is the etiopathogenesis, how the appendicitis is going, how the pathology appendicitis has occurred. That is the etiopathogenesis. Next, what are the symptoms, what are the signs, what are the investigations you do, what is the treatment. If you write under the proper side headings, you will get a good marks. Okay, you will get good marks. So the method of writing, not understanding the subject, but you should be applying the subject in a proper way. So whenever a question is asked, you should be able to write in a proper way. Okay, so I will try to gather some questions, and I will tell you in a question and answer method. Okay, I will try to explain first the topic, then I'll try to tell the how to write the answer. Okay, in the proper way, then it will be easy for you. Okay, instead of mugging up everything. So some few salient feature for each side heading. If you write for etiology, you write 4 to 5 points. If you for etiopathogenesis, you have to write 4 to 5 points. If you write like that, for each side heading, you will gather some good marks. Okay. So I would like to do like that, and just I will discuss with our professor, and I will tell you. Okay. So this is the end of this class. Okay. Thank you. ఇది క్లోజ్ చేసేయండి.